for watching the upcoming webinar on effective recruitment and selection. I'm Riley from Futurepreneur Canada. We're happy to be presenting these webinars, partnering with Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan. Today's webinar is going to be brought to you by Janelle Payant from Spark People Solutions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Janelle here. Get her slides up. And let Janelle take it away.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Riley. And just for everyone watching, or sorry, listening today, this is a pre-recorded session. So please feel free at any time following the session, once you've listened to it. I'm very open to receiving your questions, comments, or feedback, either by phone or by email, and I'll be providing that at the end of the webinar today. So thanks for tuning in wherever you are. Today we're going to talk about an introduction to recruiting effectively. And this webinar will take about 45 minutes to an hour, probably a little bit quicker since this is not a live webinar. There won't be any questions, so it might be a bit quicker. And certainly keep in mind that as I go through the content today, this is a really heavy topic, and certainly this is a very brief overview, and just to give you a bit of a taste and some quick takeaways to incorporate into your businesses. But certainly if you have any other more detailed questions that I can assist you with, don't hesitate to contact me. So we'll just start off by going through the agenda for the next few minutes. So we'll start out by talking about the job vacancy. So obviously the first thing that you're going to be needing to be dealing with when you're recruiting, and talking about that and evaluating the need. Then we'll go into writing the advertisement for the position that you're going to be recruiting for, and some things to keep in mind when you're putting together your advertisement. Related to that, we'll talk about some different places to advertise, and some that are free and some that are inexpensive to some that are quite costly, so it just depends on your budget. Then we'll talk about once you've advertised and you're getting candidates dropping off their resumes or emailing them into you, how to best screen those candidates so that you are making the best selection in the end. And then once you've done that and you're going to be going into an interview situation, we'll talk a little bit about creating and also conducting what we call behavioral-based interviews, and I'll explain more about what that is as we get to that topic. Finally, after the interview, we'll talk about evaluating the candidates and then conducting the reference check. So moving along, so talking about the job vacancy. So I guess first and foremost, when there is a vacancy, don't assume that you fill the vacancy with the same position. Just ask yourself a few questions. So first consider, are all the responsibilities still necessary? So the person that was fulfilling the role that's going to be becoming vacant, is that all what they were doing? Do you still need those same functions to be performed? Secondly, ask yourself, can the job be absorbed into other roles? So perhaps your organization has shifted or changed in the last few months or weeks, and maybe there's some other roles that could be enhanced, and maybe you have some keen individuals that might be able to take on some more. So consider whether or not the job can be absorbed into other roles. And can the responsibilities perhaps be shared? Perhaps you have some individuals that want to work different shifts or only part-time, and maybe that same function that was handled by one person full-time can be handled by 2 or 3 people and still a full-time hours, but just shared amongst individuals to balance lifestyle desires. Also ask yourself, is the job truly a permanent full-time or a part-time position, depending on the individual vacating? So this goes back again to an earlier comment on just evaluating the needs of your business and how things may or may not have changed. And perhaps if it was a full-time job before, maybe now it's just a part-time job. So consider that and be honest with yourself as you ask yourself those questions. And finally, ask yourself, can any of the responsibilities or all of the responsibilities of this vacant job be outsourced? So that could be perhaps outsourcing payroll functions, outsourcing financial functions, sales or marketing, human resources, those kinds of things. Are there components or all of that job that can be outsourced. So again, be honest with yourself when you're answering these questions, and just really make sure you have a good handle on what is necessary in the job that you're going to be recruiting for. And again, reevaluate or redesign the job description if it's necessary to do so. So the next topic is, now that you've had a good handle on what needs to be filled in this job vacancy, we're going to work on writing the advertisement. So first you want to consider who are you targeting? So basically you want to think about, are you targeting someone who needs to have certain credentials, education levels, certifications, what have you? And if you are, then where are those individuals going to be looking for work, or where are they spending their time looking? So that could be trade publications or journals, things like that that are related to that particular industry or profession. Or it could be just simply in the job section of a newspaper or on Sask Jobs or something like that, just very general and very blanketed to kind of hit as many people as you can. So just ask yourself, if you were the perfect candidate, where would you be spending your time looking? And then look at putting your advertisement where those individuals are going to be looking, so that you're attracting the right people to post for that job. So where will you be advertising? Again, that goes back to just a comment I made earlier. So are you going to be advertising online only? Are you going to be advertising in lots of different websites online? Or are you going to be advertising also in the newspaper, on the radio? Are you going to put a billboard up on the side of the highway? All those kinds of things. So you want to consider where your money is going to be best spent. So make sure that, again, to the next point, evaluating your budget. So think about the money that you spend on recruitment is very valuable, and it only goes so far. So really take the time to decide where you're going to get, I guess, the best bang for your buck. So when you're writing the actual advertisement, now that you've sort of decided who you're going to be targeting, where and you're going to be advertising, and how much you're going to be spending, now you're going to put together the actual advertisement. So what you want to do in an advertisement is highlight your organization's features and benefits. So really, by that I mean anything that is unique or perhaps unusual or different about your organization. What makes your organization stand out from other organizations that you might be competing with? So again, be honest with yourself. If you're not sure, ask around. Ask to some of your employees about what they like or don't like about working there. Get a really good handle on what attracts people there and why people stay, and highlight those things, and of course stay away from the things that maybe you thought might be good, but maybe your employees are saying that's not something that's attractive to them, and listen to what they're saying and put that into your job advertisement. And then be interesting, clear, concise, and professional. And those things may sound like common sense, but as I'll show you in a moment, sometimes that's not the case. So again, you only have so much space to put together a job advertisement. So making sure that what you're saying is interesting to the reader. You want to be using words and phrases that are going to capture the interest of the candidate that you want to be hiring. And also you want to be clear. So with all the details, the deadlines for the application, those kinds of things should all be listed in the advertisement. And again, concise. Since you can't, you don't have a full page perhaps to put together all of the details of your job, you want to just highlight some of the key things. So just being really concise on what your messaging is there. And of course, being professional. So you want to make sure that you have somebody double check what you're putting out before you actually put it there, checking for just spelling errors, grammatical errors, punctuation errors, those kinds of things that you don't want to be associating with your organization. And of course, being legally compliant. So you don't want to use words or phrases that would be considered discriminatory. So being really careful. Again, this goes back to having someone else proofread it for you to pick up on maybe something that may be not appropriate in an advertisement. And finally, determine a design and an overall image for your advertisements, and keep that consistent each time you advertise. For example, so I think it's a good recommendation to an organization to have sort of an overarching graph about their company, that they use in a job advertisement, no matter what position they're applying for. Just something that, 3 or 4 sentences that captures what that organization is about and why someone might want to work there. And then you use that same image, or sorry, same phrasing in every single job that you apply for. And then the specifics for the job actually comes into the body following that. Same thing with your logo. You want to make sure you're using that every time if you have a business logo. And also all the contact information and things like that need to be consistent. And just the look and feel of the advertise should be consistent every time. And this sort of goes back to what you may have heard before about employment branding. This kind of ties in with that. So that, when you're putting an ad out there, people may have seen it before and they're like, oh, that looks like an ad from XYZ company. Oh, yeah, it is. They identify with the look and feel of your advertisement. And that's really important and also puts out a professional foot. So here's an example of an actual advertisement that I came across on SAS Jobs. And this is exactly as it read. General laborer, a general help wanted at seed cleaning plant near X. I took out the name of the location, and group benefits package available. And that's all the ad said. Now, when you consider how many jobs there are on SAS Jobs at any given time, which can be, over 10,000 jobs in a given day, sometimes more, and you're competing, and this is a high, an area where there's a lot of jobs and not a lot of people ready to fill those jobs. So if I'm a laborer looking for work and I see this ad next to an ad that is a lot more clear, concise, has more information on the job, maybe some interesting facts about the organization, where am I probably going to apply? Well, it's easy. I'm not going to apply for this one. I'm going to apply for the one that has a bit more information. It looks interesting and exciting for me to work there. So this is an example, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, about being professional, having good information in your ad. This is an example of what not to do, and certainly may be surprising to some of you to see that this is actually a real example, but it does happen more often than you think. So just keep this in mind when you're putting together your job ad so that yours looks a lot better than this one. And here's another example of an advertisement that I came across for a retail supervisor. And again, you can see here, for example, in the first line, supervise and coordinate sales, staff, and cashiers. And then you notice that there's a period there, and then there's no period at all in the rest of the ad. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's kind of a small deal. Well, maybe it is, but it also, to somebody who sort of knows how to put together some words on a page, that's a flag. And yeah, maybe some positions that's not important, but again, you're wanting to put your best front forward as an organization, so you want to avoid those kinds of small slip-ups. Also, you'll notice where I've highlighted with that arrow, the word authorize is misspelled. So again, this is something that can be caught if you simply have somebody who is proficient and comfortable with proofreading documents. Someone would catch that. Spell check should also catch that too, but certainly we can't always rely on spell check as well, because sometimes you may use a proper word but in the wrong area, so it doesn't flag. So don't always trust spell check either. So again, another example of something that you might see in these are the ads that you're going to be competing with when you put your advertisement out. So next slide is where to advertise. So these are just some examples of where you might want to spend your advertising budget. Certainly this list is not an exhaustive list, but it is a fairly broad list, but we'll go through them and explain them a little bit. So the first one is online. So this is the most common, especially nowadays, to advertise position online, and there's many reasons for that. One is it's very cost effective and often free. So sasjobs.ca, for example, is a great resource for you. It is free. You just have to sign up for an account, and it's well known, and people have a lot of success using it. So there's really never any harm in using sasjobs.ca. And also any other online recruitment site. Generally, the amount that you pay is a lot less than perhaps a newspaper, for example. You pay a certain amount and it stays live for example, 60 days. And whereas a newspaper, on the other hand, you pay generally a bit more, sometimes a lot more depending on the type of ad, and that's only really there for a blip in time. So do get a little bit more value from online advertising, but certainly there is a place for newspaper advertisement as well, which is the second point. And newspaper advertisement can be great for especially specialty positions or positions where there may not be a lot of people looking for that type of work. So oftentimes you'll see very high level positions advertised in the newspaper, where you don't generally see entry level positions as much advertised in the newspaper. So that's one good use of a newspaper advertisement. The other time that it might be a good idea to use newspaper advertisement is if you're recruiting in a rural community or rural area, and especially if your demographic perhaps is older, and not to stereotype, but just generally speaking, the older demographic will be more apt to look in the newspaper for jobs. Not always, but often, and especially in rural centers. So if you have a community newspaper and you put a job in there and you're targeting perhaps an older demographic, that might be a great use of your advertising budget. Government service organizations, there are a few out there as well. Through Service Canada, for example, that you can again advertise a position for free, and there's mixed success on that, but certainly for some sort of entry level and some entry level skill jobs, that might be a good use of your time to post it on there as well. Trade publications. So for example, if you're looking to fill an engineering position at your firm, you may wish to advertise in an engineering journal or trade publication or news print of some kind that targets the engineering sector. Within your business is another way that you can advertise, and you may have seen, when you're out shopping or running errands, sometimes you go into a business and they have a now hiring sign on their front door, or at the till when you're making your transaction, there could be a hiring pamphlet sitting there as well. So that's another great way, depending on the type of business that you operate, to post something within your business to advertise that you're looking for help. Referrals are also excellent. Employee referrals specifically I'm referring to here. So it's really great if you have a strong employee to ask him or her for a referral. Chances are, and if you look back and talk to people who have used this well, they'll generally tell you that the people, when they ask their best and brightest employees for referrals, they generally refer people that are of the same mindset. So you're going to get somebody generally that is of the same work ethic, the same approach to their work and that kind of thing as the person that's referring them. So that's why I say, be careful if we ask for referrals from sometimes, because generally they'll refer individuals that are very similar to themselves, but very powerful way to recruit and very effective, especially if you attach any kind of incentive to them. So what I mean by that is, say you're really in a short staff situation, you need to bring in a lot of employees, and you put an employee referral plan together. It might look like, if you refer your friends to us, your relatives, what have you, and we end up hiring them, then we're going to reward you by giving you X. And that doesn't necessarily have to be monetary. It can be maybe it's an extra hour into their vacation bank or a time off bank or something like that, or it's a gift certificate or it's something like that. Or maybe you say, yeah, we're going to hire your friend, but we're not going to reward you until they've at least been here for 3 months, 6 months or something like that. So you can design referral programs all sorts of different ways to work for your business. And again, it doesn't have to have a cost associated to it, but it can. It just really depends on your individual situation. But again, I've seen referral programs work very, very well for businesses. Billboards, not as common as some of the other ways to advertise that we've spoken about, but certainly you do still see them. And they can be very effective as well, especially for areas where there is a large number of individuals needed to fill a number of positions. So you often see these when there's a plant opening up or something like that, you'll see billboards advertising those kinds of opportunities. Also, don't be afraid to use any community, religious, or associations in your community that may be able to help you advertise. So by that I mean bulletin boards at grocery stores, perhaps community boards at churches in your community, if they have something like that, or any associations that might be linked to your organization somehow, letting them know that you're looking for workers, and maybe perhaps sharing the advertisement with them, and so that they can kind of branch that out into the network of individuals that might be suited to your organization. Bulletin boards, we've kind of talked about that. It's very much related to those, the sense of community and using the resources within your communities to advertise your work. Movie theaters, I've seen this a little bit too. Certainly a very costly means to recruitment, but can be very effective. You certainly have a captive audience when you advertise in the movie theater. I think we've all been in situations where we've been out for a movie night, and you do get hit with a lot of advertising when you're waiting for the show to start. And I have seen some companies use that as a medium for hiring. I'm not sure how effective that is, but it would be interesting to know. But it's certainly another method to consider. Okay, so now we've gotten to the point where you have you've analyzed your need, you've written the advertisement, you've advertised, and now you're starting to get applications coming in, or hopefully you're getting applications coming in. So when you're screening resumes, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. And hopefully you are getting a lot of applicants. Now that isn't always the case, and of course the more applicants that you get, the more picky that you can be when you're screening resumes. So let's assume that you are getting a good number of applications coming in, and hopefully that's credited to much to do with the way that you've put together your advertisement. But the things that you want to look for is a professional resume. So just the whole look and feel of the resume. And that can be just making sure that it's typed. Now, believe it or not, I have seen and still to this day get resumes that are handwritten. So probably not the most professional way to come across. Or sometimes you get resumes that have been typed, but then someone's changed their address and just scratched it out and written their new address in pen. Not professional. So just making sure that the individual has taken the time to put together something that's clean, clear, and is looking as though that person is putting their best foot forward. Grammar and spelling, again, this is something that you want to look for. And if this is not a strength of yours, have somebody help you with this. So you want to make sure that the individual has taken the time themselves to make sure that they have proper spelling, proper grammar on their resume and their cover letter. And if that individual isn't strong in that, then they should then be using a friend, family member, coworker to help him or her put that together properly so that it comes across in the best manner. And if they haven't taken the time to do that, and they're sending you that mismatched resume and cover letter with some errors and maybe not looking professional, that should tell you something about that individual. The third thing you want to look for is being concise. And this is something really easy to see right off the bat. I once had a resume come through to me that was 17 pages long. And it was, of course, I didn't read it all, but skimming through it, it was quite a complete biography of this individual's life, which was perhaps maybe interesting, but not really appropriate or relevant for a job application. So resumes should really still be that two-page rule, in my opinion. And sometimes people say, well, that's really hard. I've been working for this long. I've had this many jobs. And I sort of use the rule of thumb. You go back 10, 12 years into your work history, but they don't really need to know that you were a cashier in high school. If you've now, you're into your late 30s or 40s, it's probably not relevant anymore. So just kind of using good judgment when people are putting together the resume to just be concise and relevant, and putting that onto their two-page document for you. You want to look for relevant education. So that's especially important if the job requires certain credentials. So you want to look for that first, and it could be an easy screen out if someone hasn't completed something that they need to, that's necessary for this particular job. That's an easy way to weed out resumes. You want to look for experience as it relates to the vacancy. And then the second point after that is transferable skills. And those are things that you're looking for. Maybe in the perfect world, the individual would have a certain kind of experience at a certain type of organization. But maybe the organization that they've worked in or the job that they've held has similar kinds of experiences associated with it that can be transferable to the job that you're filling. So don't just look at a job for its face value. Really look at it. Hopefully they've highlighted what their scope of work has been. And you can really analyze that and say like, oh, they've done X, Y, or Z, and that's really relevant to this job. And I can see how that particular experience, even though it's not maybe in the perfect organization, but I can see how it would help me in this job. And I think that that would be a really good transferable skill. So that's what I mean by really analyzing the work that they've done and how does it relate to your organization or to the work that you need to be completed in this vacant job. The other thing that you want to look for, and this can be harder to see unless you kind of really look closely, is just looking for gaps in employment. And sometimes people get creative in how they put the time that they've been in positions. So if it's vague, you want to just highlight that so that you can maybe ask about that if you end up speaking with that individual in an interview. But gaps in employment don't necessarily mean that anything is wrong or that that's bad. It just means something that you want to question. So it could well be that the gap in employment is due to a sabbatical of some kind. They were traveling, perhaps they were on a parental leave or maternity leave. So those kinds of things, very justifiable reasons for a gap, but you want to still highlight that. And the reason I bring this up is I had an experience myself once where an individual I was interviewing had a gap in his employment, and I inquired about it in the interview, and the individual told me he was in prison for that time. So things that you want to definitely ask and not overlook. And finally, you want to look for the length of time at each place of employment. So it would be a red flag to me if I was looking at a resume that someone was in jobs for 3 to 9 months at a time and never really had any longevity of any kind. Again, if it's someone that's young and just starting out in their career, there could be good reason for that. Maybe they're just trying to find their way. But again, you want to inquire about that regardless and just find out why they left those places of employment so soon. And really, you want to ask why they left their last employer anyway. So this just goes a little bit deeper and further if they've had multiple jobs for short periods of time. Okay, so now we've screened resumes and we have a stack that we would like to interview, but we don't have an interview template. So you need to create some interview questions. So behavioral-based interviews is a term that you've likely heard of before, and it's very, very commonly used in interviews today. The philosophy to behavioral-based interviews is that past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. So the interviewer asks targeted questions designed to get specific answers out of the interview, and this is called the STAR technique, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So the STAR technique is an answer from the candidate that you're interviewing that the candidate will describe to you 4 things. They will tell you what the situation was. They will tell you what the task at hand was, so what did they need to tackle. What actions did they take to handle that task in that situation? And then what was the end result? So the perfect answer would include all 4 of those components. And as an interviewer, you want to make sure that you get all those 4 components out. So the reason behavioral-based interviews are so important is because there's a lot of science behind them to back up that, again, as on that earlier slide, that past behavior predicts future behavior. So how an individual has handled the situation in the past is very likely how they will handle that situation in the future. So it's very common, in my experience, for an interviewee to answer generally. So, for example, that might sound like, oh, I would do X, Y, Z in that situation. And if you hear that, that's an opportunity for you to go back to the question and restate it. And we'll talk about how to form those. But you want to make sure that they're not talking in hypotheticals to you, that you want a specific example of the past. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So creating the questions. So again, as I mentioned very, very briefly at the beginning, using your job description as a guide. And I'm not spending a lot of time, actually any time today, talking about job descriptions, but certainly that's a really important document that you need to have, in my opinion, before you even start the recruitment function. But assuming that you have a job description, using that description as your guide. So that's what you're going to use to kind of create a lot of the questions. So your job description is going to really hone in on where that particular role is spending their time the most on. So you're going to want to answer questions around those situations the most. and perhaps things that maybe they're not spending as much time on, you maybe not going to ask as many questions or perhaps any questions on that area. It just depends on the particular job at hand. So you also want to identify the expectations of the organization for success in that job. So what does that look like? So, and it's oftentimes people get caught up in the individual that may have had the job before who has now left. It's easier when it's a brand new job, but oftentimes they have an image of what that job looks like based on the individual. So you want to try and, as best as you can, is to remove any attachment to a specific person when you're putting together the questions or analyzing the job and the expectations, because everyone is very different, and perhaps the incumbent of the role now had certain strengths in areas that they took on maybe a bit more in, and that maybe were out of scope of that particular job, but that was really great and the organization appreciated it. But it's not necessarily fair to think that that next person you hire will have that same skill set and perhaps a willingness or ability to take on those extra functions. So that's where, when you're analyzing the job at the beginning, and kind of what needs to be done is really looking at the job, not the person. And this kind of relates back to that. So you want to look at that and what needs to be done, and what experiences does the new person need to have in order to be successful in this particular role. And ideally, what you'd like to do is have one, perhaps two questions for each sort of competency area that you've identified. So a competency area might be customer service or customer interaction or dealing with customers, something along that line. That might be a critical key area for that particular role. Perhaps attention to detail is another area. So those are just a couple of examples of some competencies that you may identify as you're going through your analyzing, and then coming up with one or two questions for each of those competencies. So here's some examples of well-phrased behavioral-based questions. So please tell me about a time when you had to resolve a conflict between two or more coworkers. So that's a real specific question. So again, you're asking the candidate to think back in time when he or she had this happen to them and to tell you about it. Okay, so what you're going to listen for is specifics. So there was a time when I was at XYZ company and Sally and Tom, da 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 da. So you can already hear the specificity there. Versus, well, if that happened to me, what I would do is, and that's lots of times what you'll hear, but that's a general hypothetical answer. So you want to stay away from that and say, okay, great, that's great, but can you now tell me about a time when that happened to you? And give them lots of time to think about an answer. And people are generally nervous when they come to an interview. So you want to say, you know what, take your time. I know it's not easy to think of these answers quickly. If you want to come back to this question, you can come back to it at the end, those kinds of things, just to make it easy and relaxed, but give them time to think about a good answer to give you. Another example might be, please tell me about a time when you had to deal with a particularly demanding customer. And then finally, another example, please tell me about a time when you were particularly effective in prioritizing tasks and completing a project on schedule. So again, really specific questions, and asking for, again, a specific time in the past when they encountered a certain situation, and then to answer you in the STAR method. So the situation at hand, the task, the action that they took, and the end result. So, and sometimes you might find that helpful to have that little STAR acronym just sitting next to you, and so that if they answer only, a lot of times people they the situation, the task at hand, and the action that they took, but they don't often tell you what the end result was. So that's simply, you can say, after they've given you the answer, say, okay, great, then how did it end up? What happened? What ended up happening after you did X, Y, or Z? And then you can get the full STAR answer from them. So next, you've now come to the point where you've developed your interview template and your questions. Now, who's going to conduct the interview? And this really, really depends on the makeup of your organization and who you have in place. But certainly something to consider. You can have just one person in an interview, or you might have a panel interview, or perhaps you have interviews, one-on-one interviews set up back to back. So they talk to person A, then person B, then person C. Certainly, in my opinion, if the individual needs to be interviewed by more than one person, I always encourage people to do a panel interview. It's just more efficient use of time, especially for the candidate. And oftentimes then you avoid overlapping similar questions and things like that, and the candidate ends up repeating him or herself. So if you do need to have more than one person making the decision, try as best you can to have it a panel interview. So some of the individuals you might want to consider having involved in the interview process is, of course, the individual's direct supervisor or their manager. That is critical. The other individuals you might want to consider having is perhaps someone in a senior leadership position, maybe the supervisor's person that they report to is involved, or the company owner, depending. It really depends on the makeup of your organization. If your organization has a human resources department, it's likely that him or her will ask to be or require you to have them involved, at least in some aspect of the selection process, meeting the person and that sort of thing. You can consider having some peers involved, and I've had that happen to me in interviews in the past where, interviewing for a certain level position and having the individuals that I would be working with alongside interview me as well, which can be very, very important depending on the role and how much crossover and interaction they're going to have other areas of your organization. You may even consider having, if the position that's vacant that you're hiring for has people reporting to him or her, you might consider having some of those direct reports involved in the interview process, even if it's for a small portion. And again, this has happened to me as well when I was interviewing for a management position. The individuals that I would be managing if I was to get that job also interviewed me. So again, really good idea, and again, not always appropriate, but can be very effective, especially for certain roles. And then you might also have key business partners involved in the interview process. Generally, though, you're not going to see that unless it's a very high level position, but certainly not uncommon in CEO levels or general manager type of levels. So again, just taking that into account, and then once you've decided who's going to comprise your interview panel, then making sure that you take time in advance to prep together as a team and decide who's going to be asking which questions and those kinds of things. So just some tips for an effective interview. So some of this maybe seems like common sense to many of you. I hope it does, but I always like to cover it off because believe it or not, in organizations that I work with, oftentimes some of this is missed. So you want to first ensure that you're going to have no interruptions during your interview. So that's really, really important. So that means phone off, computers, you're not looking at your computer, you're looking at your phone for texts and things like that. You're just solely focused on the person that you're interviewing. You want to take some time to build rapport with that individual. So versus having them come in, hi, Tom, thanks for coming in today. All right, so first question is, so you want to not do that. You want to just take some time and chat with them a little bit, offer them some coffee, ask them how was your drive in today, maybe talk about the weather, upcoming plans for the weekend, anything like that as you're sort of getting ready for the interview. And that just helps to put the candidate at ease. So even though someone may seem like they're very confident and ready for the interview, and maybe they are, but maybe they're not, and they just put on a good front, but always assume that people are nervous and just take that time to build that rapport. Explain the STAR method before beginning the interview questioning. That's really important because you want to be fair to the candidate and let him or her know what you're looking for and how you're going to be evaluating their answers. So explaining from on the onset, I'm going to be asking you specific questions, and what I want to hear from you is, I want to hear from you specific times from the past where you've had this encounter or the situation happened to you or a similar situation happened to you. I want you to tell me what the situation was, the task, the action you took, and what the end result is. And then again, you're going to probably have to prompt them and remind them of that as they go through their answers, but let them know that that's your expectation up front. Making sure that you take notes. That's really, really important, especially when you're interviewing several candidates. It's easy to forget who said what, and even though you think you're going to remember, you don't. So this is really important, and also really a good A good best practice, I think, is especially in a panel interview situation, having one person ask all of the questions and then maybe one person taking notes, and maybe you flip-flop back and forth throughout the interview. And then that way you have someone focusing in just on asking the questions and looking at that person and interacting, eye contact and all that sort of thing. And then you have the other individual scribbling away, taking notes. That's fine too. And you can switch up the roles if you want to do that. Or, sometimes people are comfortable and taking notes while they're asking questions, and it really depends on the individual and their comfort level and how skilled of an interviewer that they are. There's no right or wrong there. Just make sure that you take notes. Paraphrase to ensure that you understand what the candidate said. And sometimes this is necessary, sometimes it's not, but if you're not quite sure, or it's a really detailed long story that they told you, you want to say, okay, that's great. So what I heard from you is this, 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 and this, and get confirmation from him or her that you're understanding their answer correctly. Again, as I mentioned before, ensure that the candidate does not answer with, we did XYZ. Again, even though that might be a specific situation they're telling you about, what you want to draw out from the candidate is, what did they themselves do? Not necessarily the team, but what action did they take, even if it was within a team effort, what was their role? So, and that's really, really hard for most people to do, is to talk about themselves. And I did this and I did that. It seems boastful and it's uncomfortable for people, but you really want to make them as comfortable as they can in the interview to tell you what their role was, and not to feel bad about doing that. So you want to really, if they answer with a we did this, we did that, listen to what they're saying and then say, okay, great. So what was your role in that? That sounds like a really complex initiative that you tackled, and there's lots of steps involved, but what did you do to make that happen, and get them talking about it that way. Probe when necessary. We talked about this earlier. So if they're only giving you a part of the answer and they're maybe not telling you about the end result, or they're not telling you about what their role was, probe. That's your job as an interviewer. You put these questions together for a reason. You want to make sure you get the best answer from those questions so that you can fairly evaluate all of the candidates. You also want to allow for silence. And this is really hard for a lot of people, a lot of interviewers, is they get uncomfortable and uneasy when there's silence. But it's okay to have silence. And if you explain this at the onset, or during, if this is happening to you in an interview, you've asked a question and you get this blank stare, give them a few moments. And if they're still not answering, say, you know what, why don't we come back to this question at the end? I'll just make a note here to come back to it at the end. And I've never had it happen to me that you've gone back to that question and the person still doesn't have an answer. They always think of something. So use that little trick if you need to, and explain to them always that take as much as you need to answer the question. You know, it's not easy to think of examples right off the cuff, all those kinds of things, just to ease them into relaxing and helping them think of the best answer possible. And again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, make sure that you do get an answer to each question. It's very, very, very rare that you would have a situation where you've asked a question, they can't think of an answer, and you come back to it and they still can't think of an answer. That rarely really happens. And you want to make sure, for the candidate's sake and for your sake, that you're getting an answer to all of the questions. Again, you're going to be likely evaluating a few different candidates, so you want to make sure that everyone has the same shot at getting the job. And it's really going to be hard for someone to have the same shot if they haven't answered all of the questions. And again, if they just refuse or they just can't, well, they can't, but that's really, really rare. So you want to try and make sure that everyone is given an equal opportunity to give their best answer possible. Again, related to that, always ask the same set of questions to each candidate. And that may sound obvious as it's stated, but it often happens in interviewers where an interviewer will get off track, and they'll be perhaps really interested in a particular story, and they'll start asking all these other questions about the story, and then the answer becomes more than it maybe was necessary, although it might be interesting, it may not be relevant. And then again, you're not being fair, because the other person answering the question, maybe they didn't have as an exciting answer, but it still was a valid and appropriate answer, but they didn't have the same opportunity to tell all of those other stories. So you really want to stay on track and have that scripted list of questions. And that's important also because if you're ever challenged, perhaps in a human rights case, for example, where someone didn't get a job and they say that you were towards them. You want to make sure that when the Human Rights Council comes to investigate you, that you can say, hey, you know what, we interviewed these 3 people. Here's all of the questions that we asked them. All of them were asked the same questions. Here's all of their answers. You can see here why we chose person A over person B, because look at the answers that they gave. And you can show them in black and white the robustness of someone else's answers over the candidate that didn't get selected. So your notes, that's why notes are really important, and that's why it's important to ask always the same set of questions so that there's consistency and you can never be found guilty of being discriminate and not asking the same questions to the same candidates. We've talked about allowing time for candidates to ask the questions, and then you want to follow up at the end of the interview to explain the next steps and timelines. That's really important. Don't let the candidate have to ask you when they're going to hear from you. You should be offering that up front before they have a chance to even ask you. So tell them, if how long you're interviewing for. We're going to be interviewing, until Friday, and after Friday, we're going to be making our selection. The second candidate will go through a reference check and a criminal background check, if that's what you're doing. XYZ. We expect to hear from us by this date. If we don't get in touch with you, if we don't have our answer by this date, I will still get in touch with you and let you know when our new deadline date for a decision in filling this role will be. So just be very transparent, upfront, honest with the timelines, the expectations, and next steps, and leaving it open for them to contact you if they have any further questions. So evaluating the candidates, it's a good practice to use a customized evaluation form that complements your interview questions. And again, that goes back to making sure that you're being fair and consistent with your selection process, and will help you if ever you're challenged on a hiring decision. I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. Refer to your interview notes, refresh your memory, especially if you've been interviewing over the course of several days. And then making sure that all interviewers who are involved in the process weigh in. And you may decide to have each interviewer evaluate the candidates on their own, and that's fine. Just make sure that you have one final merged document for the file at the end of the day. It just makes it a cleaner, more concise end result. And again, if you're ever challenged on a decision, it shows that the entire interview panel agreed on what's on that document. And then finally, making sure that you do a reference check and that you evaluate the reference check. So the next slide is an example, and I hope this comes through clear enough, of what you might use as an evaluation template for your interviews. So this one just is again, this can be customized to a particular organization or a particular job. This is just an example of on the far left-hand side of the different competencies, as well as education experience, and then assessing them as a doesn't meet, meets, or exceeds, and just check mark the boxes, and then you can do a formulation and scoring at the end. And then you can see at the bottom, you have interview signatures, everyone signs off on the final result. Okay, so reference checks. This generally is done when you've got your final candidate, the person you want to offer the job to, is generally when you would do the reference checks. And lots of times, believe it or not, people miss doing this, or they just don't take the time, or they don't feel it's important. But reference checks are very worthwhile and can save you a lot. So making sure that the reference is someone that the individual reported to and not a peer or a friend. So that's really important when you're going through the individual's references. If it's not clear on their reference sheet that they've given you, to clarify with that individual and say, hey, I see you've got John Smith here from the past organization you worked for. Is this someone, was John your supervisor, or was he a peer? So just get that clarification, making sure that it's someone that actually evaluated their performance. Making sure that their reference is legitimate. So people can be sneaky sometimes and put on their a name and a fake title and a phone number, and that's their friend. So you call up to do a reference check and they answer the phone so-and-so, and you say, oh yes, I see that here you supervise John at this organization, da-da-da, and you're really talking just to a friend. So making sure that the reference is legitimate. And the easy way to do that is, if you're not sure, you have some questions about it, look in the phone book, look online, verify the phone number, and call that business's phone number directly and ask for that person versus the phone number that's on the actual reference sheet that they've given you. Make notes of your conversation with the reference, but don't keep this information on the employee's file. That's really, really important because you're going to be getting sensitive information from that reference. And good or bad, it's just not appropriate that that is on the employee's file because the employee has access to his or her file at any time, and that information shouldn't be something that they ever see. So it's just really important to be respectful of that reference and what they're telling you, and keeping that information outside of the employee's file. So final steps. So now you've gone through all of this process. You've taken the time to do a reference check and you've made an offer, and hopefully you're in a position now that you've made the best selection possible for your vacancy. And then your next step, which of course is a whole nother webinar altogether, but would be to develop a really thorough onboarding plan for your new hire, so that you have a real great start to their employment, and someone that's going to stick with you for a long time and do great work for you. So that concludes the webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is my contact information. I'm based in Moose Jaw, but certainly do work all over the place, and would love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments on today's session. Don't hesitate to call me. My cell phone is there, or certainly email me as well at any time, and I would be happy to get back to you with your questions or comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Janelle, for all the great information there. And yeah, as Janelle said, everybody, please feel free to contact her with any questions. Thank you for attending.